Hello class, this is the 2019 AP Macro FRQs set 2. This is the set that our students took last year. Number 1, assume the economy of Artland is currently operating above full employment. 1A, draw a correctly labeled graph of the SRAS, LRAS, and AD curves and show each of the following: current equilibrium real output and price level and the full employment output. Price level on the y-axis, real GDP on the x, downward sloping AD, upward sloping SRAS, intersecting at real GDP, real output y1, and price level PL1. LRAS is vertical, and it is at a output level below current output. So YF is below Y1. This is an economy that's above full employment. So actual real GDP is above potential real GDP. Part B1, assume the central bank and the government do not take any policy actions to close the output gap. On your graph in Part A, show how the economy adjusts to full employment in the long run. So you've seen this many times before. When there is an absence of government action, SRAS is always going to shift towards the direction to restore full employment. So in this case, SRAS will shift to the left, decreasing real output to YF and increasing the price level to PL2. So that's how the economy adjusts to full employment in the long run. Explain the cause of the adjustment shown in Part B1. So you'll often see this as an explanation. Here it is. And SRAS shifts to the left because of the higher input prices or wages because the economy is at full employment or above full employment. C. Alternatively, suppose the government wants to close the output gap using fiscal policy. Identify a fiscal policy action the government could implement to close the output gap. So when you are at a level above full employment, the government says the economy is overheating. We need to kind of slow it down. The government's got two options. One, they could decrease government spending or decrease transfer payments, or they can increase taxes. Either of those policy actions will end up causing AD to decrease. Government spending being decreased directly affects AD. Increasing taxes reduces disposable income, which lowers consumption and investment, also lowering AD. Part 2, how will the fiscal policy action identified in Part C1 affect the unemployment rate? So the unemployment rate is going to increase because of the decrease in real output. Remember that real output and unemployment rates are inversely related. How will it affect the natural rate of unemployment? And the natural rate of unemployment will remain the same because there is no change in the rate of economic growth. So the only thing that changes NRU is economic growth or rarely economic shrinkage. C3, in closing the output gap, will the automatic adjustment identified in Part B1 produce a higher, a lower, or the same price level compared to the fiscal policy identified in Part C1? Now, the automatic adjustment produces a higher price level than fiscal policy. So the explanation that you did not have to include is because when SRAS shifts to the left, that also increases the price level. However, in Part C1, if AD shifts to the left, price level goes down. So even though both shifts cause real output to decrease, SRAS shift causes price levels to increase, while the AD shift causes the price level to decrease. Thus, the automatic adjustment of the SRAS shift produces a higher price level than the fiscal policy change. D, draw a correctly labeled graph of the market for loanable funds. Show the effect of the fiscal policy action identified in Part C1 on the equilibrium real interest rate. So quantity of loanable funds on the x-axis, real interest rate on the y-axis, downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply, starting equilibrium quantity is QE, and the starting real interest rate at RE. The decrease in government spending decreases the demand for loanable funds. So there are two possible answers. It could also increase the supply of loanable funds for others because if the government's not borrowing as much, that makes more funds available for others. So demand shifts to the left, thereby lowering the real interest rate. Or supply shifts to the right, also lowering the real interest rate. So either graph is acceptable. E, given the interest rate change identified in Part D, will the long run aggregate supply curve shift to the right, to the left, or remain the same in the long run? So LRES will eventually shift to the right because if the real interest rates decrease, that's going to lead to increased investment, which leads to increase in capital stock, which will ultimately lead to economic growth, which causes LRES to shift to the right. Number two, the EU and the US are trading partners. If the current account balance is zero, will an increase in US real income result in a current account surplus, deficit, or no change? Explain. So an increase in real income will increase American demand for all goods, but in this specific situation, European goods. That's going to lead to more American imports because now Americans have more income. They're going to buy more stuff from everywhere, including from Europe. So that's going to increase American imports, which leads to a trade deficit. Trade deficits lead to a current account deficit. B, draw a correctly labeled graph of the foreign exchange market for the euro. On your graph, show the effect of the increase in the US real income on the value of the euro relative to the US dollar. So the euro graph, the y-axis is dollars per euro. The x-axis is quantity of euros. There's our demand and supply. Now, because Americans have higher income, they're going to demand more European goods to import into America. To get those European goods, they're going to demand more euros. So the demand for euros increases, thereby strengthening the euro, increasing the exchange rate of the euro relative to the dollar. C1, now assume interest rates increase in the EU. What is the effect of the increase in interest rates in the EU on the demand for the US dollar? Explain. Now remember, dollars go to higher interest rate places. So that's going to decrease the demand for the US dollar. If you think of it this way, if the money is going to flow towards Europe, that means less investment is going to be done by Europeans to the United States. So because the interest rates in the US are lower, so they're going to keep the money at home in Europe. So that's going to decrease European demand for the US dollar. That's going to be, again, because of less capital flow from Europe to US due to the higher interest rates in Europe. C2, based on your answer to part C1, what is the effect on the value of the US dollar relative to the euro? Since the demand for the dollar decreases, the value of the US dollar will depreciate relative to the euro. The exchange rate will go down, weakening the US dollar. Number 3, Sweden and Norway use equal quantities of resources to produce food and capital goods. The table below shows the maximum possible production of food or capital goods for each country. Part A, draw a correctly labeled graph of the PPC for Sweden. Place food on the horizontal axis and capital goods on the vertical axis. Plot the relevant numerical values on the graph. I cannot tell you how important this part is. They tell you where to plot each good, and people often do it backwards. And if you do it backwards, they can't give you credit. There is no partial credit on the AP macro micro test. So if you mess one little thing up, it could torpedo your entire response. So be very careful that you put the right good on the right axis. So capital goods on the vertical axis, food on the horizontal axis. Sweden can produce up to 100 capital goods and 50 units of food. And it could be straight, as in this case, or it can also be bowed out. It doesn't matter. It doesn't say that one is better than the other. I'm going to use the straight line PPC just to make things easier. B, on your graph in part A, indicate the following. 1, a point that represents an efficient level of production labeled E, a point that represents an inefficient level of production labeled I, and a point that represents an unattainable level of production labeled U. Point I can be anywhere inside the PPC. That's inefficient. Point E, efficient, can be anywhere on the PPC itself. So it could be there, it could be higher towards the 100, it could be lower towards the 50. It doesn't matter as long as it's on the PPC. Point U has to be anywhere outside or beyond the PPC, say there. C, assume Sweden moves from producing 20 units of food and 60 units of capital goods to producing 30 units of food and 40 units of capital goods. What will happen to economic growth in Sweden in the future? So Sweden's economic growth will decrease in the future. And you didn't have to provide the explanation, but the explanation is Sweden is allocating fewer resources towards capital goods. They went from 60 units to 40 units. that's going to lead to lower rates of economic growth, which means that economic growth in Sweden will decrease. The economy is still growing. It just doesn't grow at a faster rate. D, which country has the comparative advantage in the production of capital goods? Explain. So, because it's output, we're going to look at other goes over. So Sweden produces 100 capital goods for 50 units of food. So for each capital good, they give up half a unit of food. For Norway, they produce 120 capital goods. They give up 30 units of food. So for each capital good, they would give up 1/4 a unit of food. Therefore, Norway has the comparative advantage in the production of capital goods because it has a lower opportunity cost, 0.25 food versus Sweden's 0.5 units of food. Finally, part E, based on the table above, identify a specific number of units of capital goods that could be traded for 10 units of food and be mutually beneficial. So I'm going to frame it in terms of the operating cost per unit of food. So you can see that Sweden would give up 2 units of capital goods, or 2 capital goods for each unit of food. Norway's opportunity cost is 4 capital goods per unit of food. So anything in between 2 to 4 would be mutually beneficial, but that's for each unit of capital goods, or each unit of food. We are going to look for 10. So we just multiply it by 10. So anything between 20 and 40. So Sweden will produce food and Norway will produce capital goods. Any terms of trade between 2 to 4 units of capital goods for 1 unit of food will be mutually beneficial. So that's any number for 20 to 40 capital goods could be traded for 10 units of food. So any number in that range would be fine. Anything from 21 to 39. So for example, 30 units of capital goods would have been a mutually beneficial exchange for 10 units of food. If you have any further questions on these or any other macro problems, please let me know.